Welcome to Molden and Schmidt, the podcast where we talk about the future of motoring and crucially how to make it more sustainable. My name is Nick Molden. I'm Chief Executive of Emissions Analytics. We're a company that specializes in looking at real world emissions, not what happens in official language on official tests. We're trying to get to the bottom of what really happens.
Hi, my name is Oliver Schmidt. I've been an expert in the industry for 25 years up to now. I'm mostly known for my involvement in the Volkswagen Dieselgate. And as Nick said in the beginning, we were the ones looking more into the official numbers.
And again, for a second time, we're joined by Professor Felix Leach, Associate Professor in Engineering Science at the University of Oxford, also author of a book called Racing Towards Zero. Hi, Felix.
Hello.
So in this second series of Molden and Schmidt, we're exploring the concept which Felix and I have developed, and we've published in a book called Critical Mass recently. And the idea in a nutshell is to cut through the massive complexity of vehicle emissions and try and see whether it can be boiled down to something dead simple. And what we believe we have shown is that most of the key pollutants from vehicles are strongly related to the vehicle's mass. And if this is a credible idea, then it opens up the possibility of radically simplified ways for people to buy vehicles and also for governments to tax vehicles. So today, we're going to look in depth at the science behind that. Does our idea stack up in practice? Oliver is here as our critical friend. He can be as critical or as friendly as he likes, putting our idea through its paces, because ultimately this is something we want people to do something about, that it should be something that can guide action by real consumers, but also governments as well. So let's get under the bonnet of this thing. Let's look at some of the science. So Felix, let's start off at a very high level. Why does weight matter?
Yeah, Nick, thanks very much. And I think, last time we spoke, we talked about the kind of genesis of this idea. And I think, we touched on some of these things, but I think today it's great that we can sort of dive into a bit of detail about why weight or mass is the most important parameter and how we got there. So our starting point was to think about just a simple kind of analysis of a car in motion. Just think about all the forces acting on a car that's moving. And if you work that through, if you start to think about the things that you can change or have an influence over, there's actually not very many. You can think about energy consumption, you can think about weight, size, and the torque delivered to the wheels. But everything else, like, the force due to gravity and so on, is just completely out of your control. So already we kind of narrowed it down to a very short list of parameters, just on a simple kind of back of an envelope type analysis of how a vehicle moves. And then, Nick, our next step was to get into your data. Emissions Analytics has got an amazing database of over 1,000 vehicles, real-world data from over 1,000 vehicles. And we looked at that. We looked at tailpipe CO2 emissions from those vehicles with tailpipes, NOx emissions, particulate matter, CO, hydrocarbons, both regulated and unregulated things like formaldehyde and some other kind of slightly more interesting compounds. And what we found was that weight is very strongly linked to CO2 emissions from vehicles with tailpipes, but not particularly well linked to other emissions. And we touched on this last time, that actually modern after-treatment systems like catalysts, particle filters are actually very good at clearing those things up. So the initial sort of results were not that promising. But then we started to look at other things like energy consumption of an electric vehicle. That's very closely linked to its weight. And then you can get into things that maybe people don't think about so much, such as the non-exhaust emissions. So these might be from the tires or wear on the road. And that's also very strongly linked to weight. We started to think about life cycle emissions, whether that's the life cycle of an internal combustion engine vehicle or an electric vehicle. Again, both of those are strongly linked to weight, whether that's because the weight of an electric vehicle is the size of the battery in it, or the weight of an internal combustion engine vehicle is linked to its size, right? And, how much material's gone into making that vehicle. We then thought about other parameters such as safety, such as noise and infrastructure impact, and weight's linked to all of those as well. So to think about safety, it's a bit of a double-edged sword in that if you are in a car that is heavier, you are much safer. but it is much less safe for anything that vehicle may hit, whether that's a pedestrian or another car or whatever. And then for infrastructure, of course, we talked about this last time. It's typically the fourth power of the axle weight that affects the infrastructure. And noise is also very, very closely linked to weight because of the noise from the tires and also the aerodynamics. So, sorry, I've probably given already too in-depth an introduction, but hopefully that gives you an idea of all the areas that we considered from a sort of scientific perspective.
So yeah, it's good to hear. So and what I like especially is that you focus on stuff like road use. But if you look, what is the tax used for? The tax is not used to offset any environmental impact that cars make. The tax is used to maintain the road system. So I think to come up with an idea for a taxation system that really benefits the roads is something very valuable.
Well, in that area, I mean, what we've essentially said is that the impact on infrastructure is a form of externality of because what I mean, we talk about pollution from vehicles, but actually it sits within this concept of externalities. And externalities is something where the user of a vehicle is enjoying a benefit and is exerting a cost on someone else that driver is not paying for. So actually wearing out the roads, creating potholes, whatever it is a form of externality. And if the driver is not paying for it, then they will overconsume. And so I think that's why rightly we've included that within the scope of what we're talking about. And therefore, part of a tax based on this would be reflecting that damage. So in a sense, if we were talking about some of the more populist press, they might talk about this as a pothole tax. And in some sense, there is a narrow sense in which that is true. It's a lot more than that because it looks about all the pollutants, but there is a grain of truth there.
Yeah, if you, I don't know if you have in England organizations like Fridays for Future and all these young activists that glue themselves to the road. So this
we have the gluing people, the Extinction Rebellion, and others like that.
As my friend always calls them, the Patex-Blagen, which is a not so nice word for them, but so those people actually, one of their demands would of course be that with the taxation on vehicles, you also offset every environmental impact. So this is the question. So you sent me the book. Thank you again. And I've browsed a bit through it and compared values that I knew with what's in your book. You explained it to me. So and the taxation that you collect in the end is higher than today's normal taxation plus the fuel tax that we have here. So have you considered any offset for environmental impact in your system, that you buy whatever CO2 credits or do any countermeasures? Is that included too?
So our proposal so far hasn't got any explicit carbon credits in it, because we feel like, you know, the whole point that we've come at this from is that it's technology and revenue neutral. And I think, what would you be buying a carbon credit for? I think, you know, the carbon credit system as it stands, you know, there are sort of schemes out there that allow you to buy a carbon credit for sequestering carbon, but a lot of them are for sort of carbon avoided. And I think in this realm, carbon avoided could get very tricky, because what was the sort of initial baseline CO2 that we're kind of asking? So we've sort of deliberately steered clear of carbon credits, and really just focusing on, we've taken the revenue neutrality approach when you include any annual tax, any fuel tax, and any VAT that's applied to those taxes as well. So we're staying revenue neutral, and this proposal isn't really a carbon credit proposal.
And I would observe as well, it is very easy to take this idea and say, well, it's not perfect in this respect, so let's add this extra bit in and we'll make it better. In a way, I'm counseling that we should actually try and resist that mode of thought. There is a beauty in its simplicity, and we know that it is not perfectly accurate. But the benefit of having just one factor, the mass of the vehicle, has so much benefit that we should accept that slight trading of accuracy. I mean, and you know what Felix says about the numbers in the book are based on revenue neutrality.
Yeah, okay.
So the examples you would have seen which would have higher taxation would be ones that are either heavier than average or being driven more than average. And they would be offset by equivalent lighter or less driven vehicles within that overall revenue neutrality.
Yeah, I guess every classic car enthusiast will be pleased by your proposals. Because he's only doing a few hundred kilometers with his classic car, and any other tax would be gone for him. He would just be taxed on his mileage, and if he doesn't drive at all that summer because he's busy, he doesn't pay at all. Or is there, or do you plan a basic fee at all?
No, not necessarily. No, not necessarily. No, I mean, and the scenario you describe, that a classic car owner, even if it's of £1 million classic car, if they drive 100 miles a year, quite rightly they should pay no tax because the environmental damage would be minimal.
This is one of the major arguments of the whole classic car community, that they say, yes, our cars are older, there might be a bit more pollutant in terms of tailpipe exhaust emissions, but they are driven so few that it really doesn't matter. I know this. We have some classic cars ourselves. I think the car has been restored 20 years ago. From these 20 years to today, it has done 5,000 kilometers.
So its environmental impact is almost negligible.
Yeah. I think there was more environmental impact during the restoration when you do all your sandblasting, you put your new paint on and stuff like this. But now from the driving, I think you don't have any impact there.
Yeah, and also this is really important that it's based on the mass and the mileage, because it gives the right incentive as well to not use the car. In the sense, it will be good for society to, generally speaking, encourage cycling and walking and things like that when it's appropriate to do, and public transport when it's appropriate to do so. And so, by having effectively a per mile or per kilogram mile fee, it creates that right incentive for walking and cycling and public transport. And so this should be a system that is welcomed by all those people promoting those alternative forms of transport.
And I think it's also a bit clearer because, of course, today with petrol or gasoline tax, we already have a per mile charge. It's just people don't really think about it in that way because they only think about paying for it when they fill their car with petrol or diesel or whatever. Whereas now it's really explicit. You can very easily say that, if I drive, 10% more miles, I will pay 10% more tax. It's really, the link is really, really clear, rather than having the sort of buffer of petrol and some sort of fuel efficiency in there as well. That I think means that people don't think that they pay a distance charge today when they do.
I don't know your British system, but it's kind of this here in Germany. So I would say our average vehicle tax is maybe 200 euros a year, and all the rest is collected by the fuel tax. So it's
similar in the UK. It's a little bit more expensive, I would say, on annual average in the UK. But it's the same, that the majority is collected through fuel tax.
Yeah, sure. But as you described, people don't realize that basically there is the incentive for not driving. You own a car, but if you don't drive, you save money.
That's right. Yeah, what people see at the moment is it costs 80 euros to fill up my tank. That's like a one-off hit, not that actually boils down to 15 cents or 10 cents a kilometer.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, nobody does this calculation. How much does it actually cost to drive X kilometers or miles? Yeah.
On the science side of it, I mean, there's something to add to what Felix said before. I mean, as we were looking through the different pollutants, there is actually quite a stark difference between the world of 20 years ago and the world of today.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because then a lot more of the tailpipe emissions were bad and not mass dependent. And and Oliver, it brings back to our old friend, the nitrogen oxide emissions. So pre-Dieselgate, or pre-2018, when the problem was finally solved, NOx emissions was a big problem, mainly from diesels, of course, but also it wasn't very mass dependent at all. Then you wind back another 10 years when particles were a problem from exhaust before filters were installed. Again, they weren't very mass dependent. And you go back even further before catalytic converters solving carbon monoxide. Again, not very mass dependent. And but what we've done essentially since 2018 is eliminate most of the pollutants that were bad and not mass dependent. So it has opened up. So that's why, in my view, this is a timely thing to consider, is that we're now getting towards that the stubborn pollutants left are the ones that are mass dependent. Yeah. And that is particularly true in an electrified world. So this is not resisting electrification. This is actually embracing electrification, saying this is ideal for an electrified world, and how to reconceive taxation.
Yeah. I can confirm what you said. So if you drive a modern car that is equipped with some measurement equipment like lambda scans, if you drive this through a tunnel or something, you sometimes see conversion rates higher than 100%. So it's really true that up to 2018, or then the subsequential Euro 6D, not the 6D temp, when this actually came into effect with the real driving emissions for all kinds of cars and every kind of pollutant, I think from there on cars are pretty clean. But I have one more question, Felix. Why did you deviate from the American system of footprint? Why did you choose mass over footprint? Because I think it's an incentive to buy a lighter car. But we discussed last time, when with a modern car you go into an old city, you have plenty of those in England. We have plenty of those here. If you try to park your F-150 Raptor in a parking lot in Norwich or wherever, you don't find a parking space. So why did you choose mass over footprint?
Yeah, it's a great question, Oliver. I mean, forget Norwich, the city where I live, Oxford, driving my car through Oxford is a complete nightmare. I don't do it. I use a bicycle to go into Oxford, and I only use my car when I'm leaving the city for exactly those reasons. I think it's because when we looked at the science, mass is the link. Now, of course, footprint is related to mass for most vehicles, but you could imagine if you had an F-150 sized vehicle that by magic or maybe very expensive materials or something only weighed 600 kilograms, its environmental impact would be lower. And so by linking it to mass directly, I think we incentivize the right things. Now, size is still a problem, but I think it's difficult to make a large car that doesn't weigh very much. So I think by addressing the issue that from our analysis is the actual problem, and it's got a real simplicity that everybody understands weight. You can relate it to your own life, whether you try and lose weight in your personal life, you'll find it easier to go for a run. It's a really simple concept that I think relates to many people, rather than footprint. I mean, I don't know what the footprint of my car is. I'm sure I could look it up. But, again, you could start to see that there could be ways of avoiding it, such as maybe having large overhangs if you measure your footprint from the axles and things like that. Whereas with weight, it's all just included.
Yeah. It's three-dimensional. You immediately got three times the complexity.
Yeah, this is then the last question, or not the last, but the last one that I have in mind is, why did you leave out the drag coefficient? So you described you could build a big car that is lightweight. I can also build a heavy car that has a drag coefficient of 0.5, and I can build one that has a drag coefficient of 0.2. And we know that this goes in by the factor of 3 into the force that is needed to drive or to accelerate the vehicle. Or by the power of 3 it is, yeah.
I think what I would say is, we haven't left out the drag coefficient. We have from the final answer, of course, Oliver, but certainly in our analysis, we absolutely haven't left out the drag coefficient. So there's a whole sort of section that includes this in the book. And what we found is that actually modern vehicles are converging in terms of drag coefficient. So if you think about very older vehicles, particularly open top vehicles, their drag coefficients can be quite high. But most vehicles built since about 2010 have drag coefficients between 0.2 and 0.25. Just to calibrate listeners, older vehicles might be up as high as 0.5, 0.6. So actually, drag coefficients are converging for modern vehicles. And so therefore, that's why we didn't include it, because actually it's one of these things that has kind of converge for most
Okay,
vehicles.
it's not the drag coefficient by itself, it's drag coefficient times surface area.
Exactly, yeah. And surface area is linked to mass, because the
Yeah,
bigger
of
it is,
course.
the heavier
Yeah,
it will be.
yeah. If you build an SUV, that is higher and taller, and of course, then you have a bigger surface area. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's
Plus,
linked
I mean, taking this theme as well, we aren't pretending that this is perfect. I mean, it's beautiful in its moderate inaccuracy, because it's good enough. And let's be explicit about it. You know, two of the pollutants that don't correlate with mass. I mean, one of which is what's called evaporative emissions. You know, so for an internal combustion engine, you know, that's what fuel escapes from the fuel tank, just by general evaporation. There can also be evaporative emissions from tires as well. I mean, those are that is in particular is one which is just not related to mass at all. Now that's factored into our view of 83% of the pollutants that are a problem are related to mass, but we're accepting the fact that 17% of them are not. But what we came to is that is a level of inaccuracy that is worth tolerating for all the benefits that having one variable unlocks.
Yeah, but as you said, the evaporative emissions, that is not something that's compensated by the tax. So if you don't include it, it's not something that is offset today by any tax that is paid for anything to operate my vehicle. On the other side, it's there, it's limited to a certain value, and the only thing where you have the difference is the size of your charcoal canister. So the bigger your gas tank, the bigger your charcoal canister, and then it links to weight again in the end.
Yes.
So if
but
you
the
have
linkage we found is that, yes, but that link is relatively weak. Obviously, the greater dependency is on the ambient temperature that vehicle would be exposed to, which is, that's not something you can really, make inherent in a rating of a vehicle. And also, I mean, it's also true. I mean, we could have almost said that evaporative emissions are not really a major issue anymore, and therefore they don't count as a problematic one. The reason we didn't do that is actually evaporative emissions from tires are potentially an underestimated emission that are only indirectly regulated at the moment through the shed test at certification. But actually, there may well be more volatile organics coming off the four tires than there are coming out of the fuel system.
There is something even worse, that is leather interior. Most cars I have seen in my life that go through a shed test have not new tires and have cloth interior.
Well, yeah. Well, and it applies with leather. My understanding is that's the treatment that's put on the leather.
Yeah, if you have a chromium 6 treatment, which is still legal in the US, which is not legal in Europe anymore, it's even worse. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And then as we're switching to certain biomaterials or alternatives to leather, like vegan leather, which sounds like a great thing, but is actually just means plastic. Then you get into a world of potentially increasing evaporative emissions. And it's not just the seats, it's the carpets, the dashboard, everything like that. This is one of those underestimated areas of emissions that are not terribly well studied, and therefore we included it as, and I think rightly so, and in our calculus.
Yeah, it's everything that is not cloth and not leather is, as you said, is plastic. So it's a structured plastic that's put on the seat. I think they call it leatherette, or however they were fancy names they come up with, but it's still plastic.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, we certainly have many euphemisms for plastic when it comes to cars.
Some nice sounding names. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. So I think in some ways, so we're coming towards the end of this. Oliver, I don't know if you've got any sort of last questions from your side, but we think we've got to the point where we've cast the notion of environmental damage in a very wide fashion, and such that, and we've got something that will mature well with time, because it gets better as the vehicle fleet electrifies more. And I know, I mean, in future episodes, we'll go on to talk about how the mechanics of the taxation system will work, and we'll address that next time. But I suppose let me ask you a question, Oliver. How convincing do you find it? Is this something that you think people could get their heads around? Is this science compelling?
So to be honest, I don't see the big difference to today. So I compared some. We exchanged emails about this. So I compared some values. You propose this tax for a Mini that drives 10,000 Ks or 8,000 Ks of €1,000. So my wife has a Mini. She pays 200 or 160 euros in taxes, but she pays her gas tax every time. So in the end, she comes up with nearly the same value. So the only thing is you jump from a base that is zero. And this now, as I said, you start at an average of 200 euros. So we have a taxation system in Europe, which in the beginning was just based on the displacement of the engine. It was displacement of the engine. Then it was the question, is it a gasoline or a diesel engine? This gave you a factor. And then just you multiply it with your displacement of the engine. This was your tax. And then when it came to newer emission systems, you got some credit if you had a cleaner vehicle. So it's at the moment I think you pay less than 10 euros for 100 cc's if you have a modern car. So it's really, it is a system that is already there. What I think is the most challenging, but we will touch on this in one of the later episodes, is your transition scheme. How, if you implement your system right now, you scare everybody off an electric vehicle because the electric vehicle is heavier. So this means your tax for an electric vehicle driving by your math should be higher. So there we need really to explain in detail, how can a transition work? How do I still have a reward for driving an EV today? So how do we phase out the fuel tax or phase in your tax or have both for a similar period or whatever? So I think this will be very important.
Yeah, Oliver,
to convince more people.
That's for a future episode,
Yeah,
and we
exactly.
have a transition plan that we will.
Yeah.
But I would just comment, I think it's reassuring that you've run our numbers that we didn't talk to you about before we wrote the book, in terms of your particular case in Germany, and have said that actually you won't notice much difference, because of course that's our hope, is that if someone is driving a relatively average vehicle like a Mini, a relatively average amount, like say 10,000 kilometers, something like this, that they won't notice much difference. It's people who are driving very large vehicles or who are driving large amounts or very small amounts who will notice the difference. Yeah, so I think in a sense it's reassuring that you, in your case, don't notice a difference.
But I think even they should notice today, because if I have a bigger, heavier car, we all know that my CO2 emissions equals my fuel economy. It is basically linear. Is kind of linear to what I drive. So it's especially here where we have no speed limits. So the car. So if you go on the autobahn, if you exceed 150, 160, 170 kilometers, this is where you really see your fuel consumption going up to 20 liters per 100 kilometers, when they need the fuel to cool the engine or the turbocharger.
That's not something we have in the UK. So I think maybe that's where Germany and the UK will be slightly different in terms of the immediate impact.
Yeah.
Well, let's not get into an argument about speed limits, because that might go on all night. So on that note, we will. I can feel a draw towards talking about the practicalities and the taxation. So we will tackle that next time. So I'd like to draw a close there. Thank you very much, Oliver, for quizzing us. To Felix, thank you very much as well. Hopefully that gives a quick insight into the scientific underpinning. Of course, for those interested, the book is available from many retail outlets. Thank you, Felix. So please, and we very much welcome challenge and feedback. This is a proposal we think has got a lot of strengths, but needs to be proven in the white heat of political argument. So on that note, Oliver, thank you very much. Felix, thank you to you too. And we'll join you all next time. Thank you very much. Bye.